So, in 1985, a young Christian family moved from northern Mississippi to southern Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And their goal, what they'd been doing in Mississippi, was to continue the home education of their two children, 5th grade and 3rd grade. They didn't know a lot about it. You couldn't just go and Google during that time frame. The father took a job working for Kellogg's, the cereal company in Landisville. And what happened is they bought a home near Quarryville, Pennsylvania, and they knew they were allowed to homeschool in Pennsylvania, but they didn't understand what the rules were. So they went through the process. They met with someone from the school district, and interestingly, the new superintendent for the school system wanted to be intimately involved in those conversations, which was a warning sign for them, of course. And then what happened is they met with the school and they met with the superintendent, and the superintendent and the school district were clearly had a lot of animus towards home education. But then they said to them, well, sure, you can homeschool your kids, but here's the agreement that we want you to sign. You have to sign this agreement if we're going to approve the home education program in our school district. And if you go back to 1985, I know Pastor Saint knows some of the things I'm going to say here. You can think about the kinds of things that would have been in that agreement. One was you had to use the same textbook as the government schools. So whatever textbooks they were using, that's what you had to use. You had to agree to use the same curriculum. Well, it gets better. You had to agree to use the same academic calendar as the school system. You had to even agree to use the same standard daily schedule and lesson plan as the school district. What that means is if the standard in the school district was at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, a 3rd grader's learning math, that's what you were expected to do in the home. The final kicker for this agreement that they wanted our parents, my parents, this is the story of my family, to sign was this. If you agree, if you're going to get approval to homeschool your children in our school district, you have to sign a waiver saying that you will allow anyone from Children and Youth Services, CPS, or the school district to come into your home unannounced at any time during the school year to inspect your home and inspect what you're doing. No notice. They had to sign a waiver saying that they agreed and they would not contest in court if the school district came in, was not satisfied with what they were doing in the education of the children. They would immediately enroll the kids in government school, and they would agree that they were acknowledging that if that occurred, it would be reported to the county and it would start an educational neglect investigation into the family. So I begin my comments to you this afternoon, and we're going to try to stay very practical this afternoon, but I begin with that story to say that's what my parents experienced, and I think it's instructive to us. It's instructive to us for a couple of reasons, but it does help give us a framework for the kinds of things we have to think about as Christian families when it comes to the home education of our children. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, I'm just going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to talk about what our standard is for our family, how we think about that, how we establish a standard. The second thing I'm going to talk about is just give you some thoughts to think about when it comes to dealing with the state. And I'm going to use the state broadly. I'm going to talk about the state in a couple of areas, but just understanding our opponent when it comes to these issues. And the final thing, I'm just going to give you some practical advice that I have learned over time, both as a homeschooling parent and as an attorney in dealing with the state when it comes to these issues. So the first thing I want to talk about is a standard, right? And so we've heard a lot today, and I know because you're here, you're in an environment where you're learning about God's law, how the Bible establishes the authority of the state, the authority of the church, the authority of the family. What I would encourage all of you to be doing as mothers and fathers together is coming together and trying to figure out where your standards are, where your lines are for your family, what things you're willing to comply with, and what things you will say, no, that I cannot comply with. So let's go back to the example of my parents, my family. Does anyone think my parents were willing to sign that agreement? Absolutely not. Why not? Everything about it was antithetical to their biblical mandate to discipline, disciple, and educate their children. teaching the same textbooks, curriculum as the government school? No way they were going to agree to that. Agreeing to the same academic schedule and calendar? Absolutely not. Giving over parental authority, opening up your home to the state for inspection at any time, unannounced, with no boundaries? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. They were not going to agree to that. So they had choices to make, and they had their standards to figure out. They knew that violated their standards. So what choices did they have? What choices does any family have in that scenario? You have choices. They're not always easy choices, right? One choice is move. My parents could have said, okay, we're moving out of Lancaster County, we're moving out of the state, we're going somewhere else. Financially, that wasn't feasible. They didn't know what they were walking into. They bought a home. That was very difficult. Could they have figured that out eventually? They could have if things didn't change, but that was not a choice they made. They chose to stay. And they chose to fight back. And they fought back in coordination with Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And if anybody knows anything about Pennsylvania homeschooling during that time, they were not alone. There was a lot of litigation. There was a lot of work from Homeschool Legal Defense. There was a lot of pushback against a lot of different school districts. Some school districts were fine. Some were decent to work with. But we are only where we're at now in Pennsylvania because of those fights that were had. And I don't agree with where we're at in Pennsylvania. I've had conversations with people that are here about that. I don't really think the state should be as involved in home education as they are. But we have to ask ourselves as Christian parents, can we comply without violating our convictions? And then when are we called upon to fight back, and what does that look like? And I'll submit to you, not every family here is called to fight that fight in time. Some of us are called to comply because we have other battles to fight, and we don't have to sacrifice our convictions necessarily under the current laws in most situations. So one analogy I want you to think about as a Christian family, as you're thinking about how you build your standards so you're prepared to interact with the state, is this. Think of it in terms of a fence. Think of it in terms of a fence, and what I mean is when you're building a fence, whether it's to keep something out or keep something in your land, to protect it, you don't build the fence, you don't start with the fence on your neighbor's property, right? You build your own fence first. You protect that first. You know, these are our standards. This is what we need to take care of first. This is my obligation as a Christian father, as a Christian home. I need to establish these walls, these boundaries based on biblical principles for my family. When this is secured, there may be times where we go outside of that fence and take the fight farther. We may know that our fence would help our neighbor. We don't always know when that fight's going to come. But I just want you to think about it that way. Because when we're talking about raising a family and dealing with the state in the modern world, we have to recognize that the dominant religion we are going to be coming up against isn't just some sort of just benign secularism, because there's no such thing. It's actually atheistic secular humanism, which is a religion that places man as God and rejects Christ, right? And so we have to know that's what we're dealing with. It's not simply neutral. It's actually opposed to what we believe in Scripture. So we have to be wise as we deal with this. So what do I mean? What I'm encouraging you to do when I say establish a standard is have sober conversations with your family together, husbands and wives together, with your pastor, with your church, understanding where your lines are, understand when you're going to draw them, when you're going to make concessions, and I use that word very carefully, concessions, because they don't compromise biblical principles, but allow you to continue raising your family, right? And you have to be very cautious in how you approach this. But you need to talk about those things ahead of time before you have to deal with the state, so you have some concepts, you have some principles in place. So I'd encourage you to do that. And so as we think about what that standard is, we think about where those things are. For my parents, it was easy, because the state overreach was so obvious and clear. They were coming way over that fence. They were tearing down the fence, right? There really was no distinction. They weren't going to use that textbook. They weren't going to use that curriculum. They weren't going to give up their rights. They didn't have a choice. So moving away wasn't an option. They certainly were not going to comply with all of that. And so they fought back, and then they were comfortable complying with something more similar to the current standard. Now, I'll submit to you, when I moved back, so I left Pennsylvania, I served on active duty in the Air Force for 11 years, and I came back home to Pennsylvania to raise my family and educate my two daughters that are here in a home education program. And one of the first things I did was I got involved with CHAP, and I went and I testified in front of the House Education Committee to help change the law, because back in 2012 timeframe, Pennsylvania law with homeschooling actually changed significantly. There was actually a significant change. We still have to do some of the same things with evaluations that you're all familiar with if you homeschool. But one of the things that changed is that the the superintendent, the school district, they can no longer overrule the determination of your evaluators. Did you know that? Under the law, if your evaluator approves of what you're doing and you get to choose your evaluator, you can choose a Christian homeschooling evaluator. The superintendent doesn't have any authority or right to overrule that decision. All they're really doing in the school district now is compiling the paperwork. They have to get the letter, they have to make sure the paperwork's all there. Again, I disagree. I don't think it's their role to do that. I think it goes too far. But for our family, we have always been comfortable saying, okay, we can comply with that without compromising, at least for now in Pennsylvania. So, again, have those hard conversations about standards. The second thing I want to talk about is knowing your opponent. And I say that very carefully, and I don't do that from a place of fear, but just understand. It's important that we understand when we engage with the state and think of the state as coming into conflict potentially with what's going on in your family and in your home, there's three places where it's going to happen most often, where you're going to be most vulnerable. Three places generally: medical, education, and then it's going to be some form of child supervision, child neglect. For Christians, sometimes if we spank our children, it could be a child abuse allegation, right? So that's the reality. It's medical, educational, child protective services. So what do we know? If we're Christians, we're being sober-minded, and we're in the world, what do we know about medical? What do we know about the medical system today, the primary medical system? Do you think most doctors are educated, indoctrinated, and informed in biblical teaching and have a biblical perspective, a creation-oriented perspective about medicine? They don't. It's far worse than that, right? It's far worse than that. Many of them are indoctrinated to believe that anyone that dares, as a parent or otherwise, to question the standard boilerplate, this is what everyone is supposed to do medically, they're indoctrinated to think you're foolish, you're unwise, you're crazy if you don't do that. There are doctors out there who think if your children don't receive every single vaccination as recommended by the American Pediatric Association, you're killing your kids, right? Every pediatrician we've ever been to, and we had a lot when we were in the military, when we didn't vaccinate our children, told us the same exact story. Every single pediatrician. It's fascinating. Within the last 6 months, they all had a family and a patient who had an infant that died of pertussis or whooping cough. In the last 6 months, every single pediatrician I've ever met has had that same tragic thing happen. Isn't that fascinating, right? That's fascinating. But I say that to say you have to know and understand for your family, when you're dealing with doctors, when you're dealing with medical providers, that is a tension point. They have a different worldview than we do. There is a potential for a problem there if you don't just do exactly what they say every time they say to do it. It's a friction point, that's a potential danger. So you have to know that, you have to understand that. The second is in dealing with the education system. I don't think for this crowd I have to say it, but if you have your kids in a government school, your family is at risk. Your family is at extreme risk for a whole lot of things, but you're also at extreme risk to have a negative interaction with the state. Because your principles, what you're doing in your home, is in direct opposition to atheistic, secular humanism. That's the religion of these schools. And just think about the level of indoctrination these teachers have, right? Think of the average public school teacher. Master's degree, maybe a doctorate degree, and it all comes from this level of indoctrination. It's CRT, it's communism, it's secular humanism informing everything they do. And they believe that you as a parent, it's foolish, it's hurting the kids socially and psychologically to educate your child at home. That's what they think. That's what they're indoctrinated to believe. They're the experts. Why would a parent know more than we do about how to educate a child? That's what they believe. That's what they're indoctrinated. That's their belief system. It's even worse when we start talking about social workers with children and youth services or child protective services. They're indoctrinated in such a level, and one of the things I do is I spend time, believe it or not, I want to burn my eyes out sometimes after I do it, but I look through the training that these social workers go through in the state of Pennsylvania. Let me tell you, it's worse than you could imagine. Think about the worst possible things a social worker could be taught in this training. It's worse than that. Human sexuality, gender, all of those things. Biblical view of marriage and family, they are taught that is evil. Think about that. They are taught as evil. They're taught things like, if your 8-year-old kid thinks they're a hippopotamus, and you don't support them in that and start feeding them hay and build them, a pond to live in, that you're literally killing your child. That's what they're taught. They're taught that the suicide rates are so high, your child is at risk and the parents are killing the child. They literally see you as Christian parents often as a danger and a threat to your children. Just think about that. It's sobering, right? That's the reality of the world we live in, right? So that's not pleasant to think about. That's hard. Okay. So now what I want to go into is I want to talk about practically then, what do we do about it? What are practical things we can do? If we know we have a standard, we know that standard is going to bump up against the state, right? We know that's going to come into conflict. What do we do? So I just want to give you some very practical things to think about and incorporate. One thing is this, and again, just forgive me, I think about this from a lawyer. I think about this from the terms of mitigating risk and protecting risk for my clients, right? That's what I think about, okay? Now I do that from a biblical perspective, and I think long and hard about that. And sometimes there are clients that I have that are ready to pick a fight. They're in a situation where it makes sense to pick a fight, right? And there are other things where we say, okay, we don't want to do this, but we can do this without a compromise, and we believe in good faith that it's going to turn out really well, that this is the best way to get the state out of my home, right? Because sometimes that's the answer. When we're bumping up against the state, sometimes the best answer is, what is the fastest way to get off their radar, to get them out of our lives and out of our homes so we never have to deal with them again, right? So, one thing I want you to think about is this. If we look statistically at where families get into problems, one is in the arena of medical care, right? So whether that's disagreements over medical care, whether that's a healthcare provider reporting some sort of abuse or something else, that's a common thing. So what I would encourage all of you to do is make sure you have an excellent primary care provider for your family. That can be a naturally minded doctor, that can be something else, but that is what you need. Now for us, we've used the same doctor in Hershey, Pennsylvania for over a decade now, and it's a DO, not an MD. Okay, that matters if you know anything about the education and training they receive. DOs are often much more open-minded. They get a more holistic set of training than MDs do. MDs are just pharmacists, okay? So it's important to keep that in mind. But here's the thing. Here's what happens. If your family's going to engage in CPS in any way, something happens, a complaint is made, a neighbor sees your kids playing in the yard during the school day, or a delivery driver comes to the house and they think kids aren't being supervised properly, and they make a report, right? These are all things that we see, and all of a sudden CPS is at your door. Right? Every example I'm giving is something that's actually happened to a family, many in Pennsylvania. So one thing they're going to look for is whether or not there is evidence of medical care for your children. That's just a standard thing that they look at. That's the criteria they look at. So if you're a family that has proof that you have a family doctor and that you take your kids to well child appointments once a year, that's almost de facto proof that you're good parents to the state of Pennsylvania, okay? Now that's crazy. I don't necessarily agree with taking healthy kids to the doctor every year. I get that. I understand the pushback, right? But I'm just telling you the reality. So it's very important that you have a primary care doctor that is not going to push vaccines, that's not going to report you to the state for not giving your child vaccines. It's important that you ask those questions. And it's important that you move forward and move through this, so that you can have that proof, that record, if you ever come into conflict with the state. So I cannot emphasize that enough. That's one of the things, if you know Bradley Pierce from Heritage Defense, who I work with quite a bit, it's one of the things he talks about all the time. Have a good doctor, have a record of medical care for your children. Critically important. The second thing I'll tell you as a practical matter is when you are thinking about your standards for your family and you're thinking about your education plan for your family, just know, even if your kids aren't in government school, they're going to be doing things that bring them into public context, right? Could be sports, could be band, could be orchestra, could be theater, could be a lot of different things where they're going to come into interaction with that public system. And what I'll say to you is, teach your kids appropriately, at appropriate ages, 2 phrases. Critically important, very valuable phrases to teach your kids in those settings. One is, it Isn't this a conversation I should be having with my parents? Sounds like a very simple phrase, but it's a very powerful phrase if a kid is old enough to say that to someone who starts asking them questions. Shouldn't that be a conversation I should be having with my parents? Think about that. There's a lot of context that could come up. Social worker starts, coach starts asking about discipline in the home or any of those things. Isn't this a conversation I should be having with my parents? That sets them back. That gives them a warning to say, okay, actually, yes, that's probably the right thing to do, right? Number one. Number two is your child needs to be able to say, again, at appropriate age, teach them this. I am uncomfortable having this conversation without a parent present. It's two phrases. Shouldn't I be having this conversation with my parents? Number one. Number two, I am uncomfortable having this conversation without my parent. That applies in medical settings, educational settings, all kinds of settings. Teach your kid those phrases. Think about the ages, think about the maturity level of your kids. Teach your kids those two phrases. You would be amazed how powerful those two phrases are. Okay? Save you a lot of heartache in your life. All right, next practical thing, this is obvious, it's community. Be in community. If you homeschool, don't homeschool in a vacuum. Be involved in a co-op, be involved in a church. Have a community around you so you can have conversations about this. They can help you with standards. They can point you to resources. That's really important. Community is important. The last thing I will say is this. If you're going to be in a situation where you're being confronted by the state is coming over that fence that you've built around your family, or you're having another interaction, it is and it does matter, and I know I'm saying this as an attorney, you need legal counsel. You need legal counsel. You need to be part of organizations like the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. You also need to be part of an organization called Heritage Defense. Again, my opinion, I'm an affiliated attorney with them. I do work with them. My dear friend Bradley Pierce runs that organization. But what Heritage Defense does that is so important is they help you with CPS. HSLDA doesn't do that. They're focused on education. If CPS knocks at your door and you're a member of Heritage Defense 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, someone's going to answer the phone. Not only are they going to give you instant advice, give you an idea of what your rights are and say you don't just have to open the door just yet to the state. They're going to connect you with an attorney in your area that can help, that can walk you through and can deal directly with Child Protective Services, Children and Youth Services. It's a powerful thing. It doesn't cost a lot, but Heritage Defense, Bradley is a wonderful Reformed Christian brother. He's part of Foundation to Abolish Abortion. Ben Zeisloff's here. Ben works with Bradley, but Heritage Defense is a great organization, and they will help. And I will tell you, since I've been working with Heritage Defense, and this is kind of the positive thing I'll end with, because I feel like this has been a heavy things, right? But know this. Ethan and I were talking about this earlier. Over 80% of cases where Child Protective Services is called don't end in any kind of a problem for the family. Over 80% are resolved without significant issues for the family. That's a positive thing. I will tell you, in my experience in Pennsylvania, over the last decade that I've been back here, I have yet to have a family that I have worked with that's ever had a founded allegation of abuse, maltreatment, neglect, or otherwise when I have been involved from the beginning. In other words, from when CPS has knocked on the door and I've been there from the very beginning, they have turned out well because God has given me the tools and I have connections to other people, if I don't have it, to help Christian families navigate that situation. So, as I wrap this afternoon, this is an awesome event. Thank you, Matt, for allowing me to be part of this. Just praise God to be here. It's always an encouragement to be here with people like all of you, and I just want to say thank you for that opportunity. Just be encouraged because all the people here are a resource to you. We don't have to live in fear. If we have our standards, if we know what we're dealing with, and we have a plan in place so we're prepared to deal with these things, we can raise our children in a lost and dying world in a way that furthers the kingdom and builds the kingdom and takes back this world for Christ, and that's my encouragement to all of you. So thank you.